Welcome to the November 15th, 2023 meeting of the Thurston County Planning Commission. The Thurston County Planning Commission is a citizens advisory committee to the Board of County Commissioners on land use planning matters such as the comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance amendments. Planning Commission actions are in the form of recommendation to the county commissioners, who are the final decision makers. All Planning Commission meetings are open to the public. Citizens are welcome to observe all Planning Commission briefings and work sessions. We welcome public comment on those topics for which a public hearing has not yet been held. My name is Eric Casino. I'm this season's chair and I reside in District 2. We'll start our introductions of the rest of the Planning Commission here in the boardroom. Down over here with Commissioner Pestinger.
Kevin Pestinger, District 1.
Derek Day, District 1.
Joel Hanson, District 3.
Barry Halverson, District 2.
Helen Wheatley, District 1.
Jim Simmons, District 3.
Thank you very much. And it does look like we have a quorum tonight. So if everybody's had an opportunity to look over the agenda, I'd entertain a motion.
Move to approve the agenda.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any additions that need to be made? With that, call for the vote.
Commissioner Hanson,
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons,
Aye.
Commissioner Pessinger,
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley,
Aye.
Vice Chair Day,
Aye.
Chair Casino.
Aye, the agenda has been accepted. Right, with hopefully everybody has looked over our meeting minutes from November 1st, 2023. And if so, I entertain a motion.
Move to approve the meeting minutes and accept the audio as the official meeting record for November 1st, 2023.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the meeting minutes? Commissioner Pestinger?
All of this looks good and accurate. I would just say that I've made a large number of questions and not one of them is listed in here. I also made some jokes that are probably not worth repeating, but just for future.
I think they'll be reflected in the audio recording, which is the
Yeah,
official
the
record,
official record.
especially the jokes. Having no further discussion, the motion is to approve the meeting minutes and accept the audio as the official meeting record of our November 1st, 2023 meeting. And call for that vote.
Commissioner Hanson,
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons,
Aye.
Commissioner Pessinger,
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley,
Aye.
Vice Chair Day,
Aye.
Chair Casino.
Aye, those meeting minutes are accepted. Thank you very much. With that, we're going to move on to the public communication portion of our meeting. And we're going to start off here in the boardroom. If there's anybody that would like to address the Planning Commission, if you do, you can come up and you have 3 minutes. But it doesn't look like anybody in the boardroom is interested in addressing the Planning Commission. So do we have anybody online? Please raise your hand if you'd like to address the Planning Commission, and we'll have 3 minutes. And looks like Celeste, if you could identify yourself and what part of the county you live in, we'd be happy to hear from you. You'll have to unmute yourself as well, Celeste.
I'm trying to do that now. Forgive me.
We can hear you. We can hear you now.
Okay, that's great. Unfortunately, this will be my first meeting, although I have been following some of the planning and regulation emails and newsletters, and I did do a survey about land use, and I did vote for some people and speak to some people. What I was hoping to focus my time on is the land use laws and regulations in regards to houseless people, who I refer to as refugees, being that they are a displaced resident of our country. I don't really want to call them homeless. I don't think people who live outside are specifically in some sort of a bad state. I don't think living outside is the worst thing. I do think not having services available to you while you are living outside is a detriment. So as far as land use and regulation, I'm just wondering if the city can afford to provide, I don't know how many acres we could start working on to find a city, a small refugee camp area where we could then have trailers of services like a free clinic, showers, laundry, kind of on the outskirts. I just want to know if there is any kind of collaboration that's being had with services and land use and just trying to create a space. I do know that people worry about security, but if there's farmland or farming or any sort of thing that people can do with themselves, I understand that they would probably feel more like citizens in the community. So I'm focusing everything that I'm saying strictly on finding land, finding ways that we could zone or enough acreage that we could build a community of people who do live outside in a safe way over the next 10, 15 years. So that's really all I want us to be focusing our energy on. That's what I spend my time thinking about. So hopefully that's my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Celeste, if you would you please identify yourself for the record and where you live?
My name is Laura Celeste Johnson. I am a transit operator for Intercity Transit, and I live in Lacey, and I've been voting ever since I've moved to Olympia.
Great, thank you very much for your comments.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Do we have anybody else online that'd like to address the Planning Commission? I don't think anybody else is looking to address us. So we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which is item number 4, which is a work session on Thurston 2045, a commerce presentation on housing element allocation methodology. And I think we're going to start this off with Manager Arai.
Thank you. We are very fortunate to have Laura Hutchison, a senior planner with the Department of Commerce, here with us tonight, really to kick off our housing element update. It's going to be a very complex update. There's a lot of pieces coming out of recent legislation. So this is really meant as a primer, sort of. I would expect a lot of absorption. You might not be able to answer all the questions, specifically ones related to how this is going to look in Thurston County at this moment, but happy to do our best to collect those questions and get back to you in future meetings, whether that be Laura helping us respond to them or us here at Thurston County doing the research. I also want to introduce Ana Rodriguez, and she is our newest planner. So she is in Maya's Growth Management Services.
Sorry, can you repeat the name?
Ana, A-N-A, Rodriguez, R-O-D-R-I-G-U-E-Z.
Thank you, welcome.
Yeah. So would you like to give a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure, I would love to. Hi, everyone.
Putting you on this.
It's fine, we're fine. Like Ashley said, my name's Ana Rodriguez. I've been here for a month tomorrow, so I know everything and I'm well-versed to answer any and all questions at this point. I came from the state. I was with the Department of Ecology. Prior to that, I was living in Texas. My husband is a behavioral health officer at JBLM, so we got moved here. I'm incredibly grateful to be here and plan on being here until my body is forced to be removed. So I'm very excited to be working with the county so far. It's been great, and I'm very excited to get to know you all and work with you throughout this process.
Well, we hope we get you a name tag soon.
Yeah, sorry about that. But Ana has been working on the housing piece. So she has spent a lot of that month diving into all of the various documents and webinars, getting her arms around it, going to our regional housing council meetings, trying to meet other jurisdictional partners. So yeah, we're very excited to have her, and I will turn it over to Laura.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here today. My name is Laura Hodgson. I'm a senior planner at the Department of Commerce in the Growth Management Services Unit. And my role is to provide technical assistance to jurisdictions as they plan for housing over the next 20 years. So in my role, I help develop the guidance to interpret the statute that the legislature passed in 2021. And now I'm helping planners and local governments work through the work to update their housing elements so that they can better plan for the housing needs, because there's a lot that's changed in the housing environment, and with housing prices increasing so much and people having housing out of reach. So we want to the legislature wants people to take a more active role in how they plan for housing, local government. So I'm excited to talk to you about these housing element updates and a few updates about recent legislative changes, which I'll cover at the end. Next slide, please. So at the Department of Commerce, you probably are familiar with us through the lens of growth management planning, but we also cover all of these other areas of community and economic development, from infrastructure and broadband to energy and economic development. So we hope that you are aware of some of the other work that we do, and if not, we encourage you to check out our website and look at the other opportunities that we support local governments with. Next slide, please. In 2021, the legislature significantly updated the GMA housing goal. It changed the softer language of encourage affordable housing to plan for and accommodate housing for all economic segments. And in doing so, it directed the Department of Commerce to take a more active role and local government to take a more active role in achieving their housing needs and helping to plan for them. It directed the Department of Commerce to provide specific projections of housing needs for all income brackets, including emergency housing and permanent supportive housing. And we have done so at the countywide level, and I'll talk to you more about that in a second. Then it directed local governments to take a more active role in the housing element work. So it directed local governments to use those numbers that are provided by Commerce, and in doing so, there's a role to take into taking the countywide numbers and dividing them up to local jurisdictions. And then they need to do what they previously did, which was make sure they had sufficient land capacity. But now the role of the land capacity analysis is to make sure that we have land capacity for all income levels. So I'll talk about that, as well as the updated requirement or clarification of what make adequate provisions for all economic segments was. Previously, it was just make adequate provisions, and that was a little vague. And they've now specified what that means, as well as added a new requirement to address and begin to undo racially disparate impacts, displacement, and exclusion. We know that past planning policies have led to exclusion and disparate impacts in our communities. And because land use planning has played a role in those disparate impacts, the legislature is asking land use planners and local communities to begin to undo those impacts to the extent that they're able to do so, recognizing that we had a role, that we collectively as society had a role in creating some of those and promulgating some of those. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these and then wrap up with those legislative changes. Next slide, please. There's a lot of material to the housing element, but if you kind of think about it in these discrete pieces, and we have more guidance on each of these elements in our specific housing element guidance. We've broken that up into 3 books, as well as webinars that are also available. So the 4 steps kind of include identifying what your projected housing needs are from the Department of Commerce tool that we've created. And there's some flexibility in that, which I'll go over, and deciding how those housing needs are divided up from the county to the individual jurisdictions. Identifying sufficient land capacity, identifying those barriers to affordable housing or achieving housing availability, and documenting actions to address those barriers, identifying if there are racially disparate impacts and beginning to undo those impacts of displacement and exclusion, and then updating your policies and regulations. And again, this points just to where we have the resources available on all of these items.
I have a question.
Sure.
Clarifying that.
Yeah.
When you say identify racially disparate impacts, do you mean historically or in the current plan?
It means currently, with the understanding of you need to look at a historical lens to kind of understand how we've gotten to where we are today. What we recommend doing is looking at what the data shows in terms of disparities and exclusion and displacement in your jurisdiction. And we've provided some data to help jurisdictions do that. And then walking through a process to look at how we can change the trajectory. And I'll go over that towards the end. Next slide, please. So we went through an extensive process next slide, please, to project the future housing needs in the state of Washington. And this is just a quick summary of what it means. What we've found is
Statewide, these numbers.
these are statewide numbers, yeah. So we involved a lot of agencies and experts in determining what our future projected housing needs were. And we took into account underproduction, for example, ever since 2010 and the downturn there, we haven't been producing enough housing to keep up. So we have this undersupply of housing based on our needs. We also want to make sure we have enough homes to make sure that people can move around, which means a healthy vacancy rate, and also remove second homes from the equation because they don't provide permanent housing for our residents. And what this means in terms of what we projected is that we're kind of going to have to shift the way we've planned for housing. In the past, we've typically planned for your typical quarter-acre subdivision lot or larger in some places, or slightly smaller in some places. But unfortunately, based on economics, that's not affordable to most residents anymore. And taking into account what residents can afford and eliminating cost burdening of renters, meaning that we don't want anybody to pay more than 30% of their income, because then they can't pay for their transportation, their medical bills, their retirement, their other personal needs. What it means is that we're going to have to shift to the type of housing that we're going to need to plan for in the future. Next slide, please. So to understand what those projected housing needs are for each county, we've developed a tool to help you identify what those housing needs are. Because within the framework of the Growth Management Act, counties are allowed to decide how much they think they will grow over the next 20 years. They're given a range of population projection that, based on the Office of Financial Management and their key demographers, they think is the most likely scenario. So they say the low range is, in this case, 345,000, and the high range is 431,000 for Thurston County, but the most likely range is 389,000. So given that, we needed to create a dynamic tool to show what the projected housing needs were based on taking into account all of those variables that we looked at to understand and predict what future housing needs are. Based on what your county will decide as your future projection of population, it breaks down the future housing needs based on the different income brackets, showing in total what the net new need is at the bottom line here. And so we have this Excel spreadsheet online that jurisdictions can use, and we're happy to provide more details or walk you through that. Next slide. Now, we have provided the housing need populate projections at the countywide level. And the reason we did that is because if we were to go through and tell every individual jurisdiction what their future housing needs were, we would take away some of the local control that you already have. Counties and their jurisdictions know best where to accommodate growth, what their infrastructure constraints are. So, and they currently decide where population growth goes within the county. So to be consistent with that framework, we provided the housing need projections at the countywide level and created guidance for how jurisdictions will divide up or allocate those housing needs from the county level to the individual jurisdiction. And in doing so, we've provided a tool to help them do that. So previously, counties decided how many people they were going to plan for and divided up those number of people. That didn't take into account what people can actually afford in terms of housing. So now they get the total, they choose the number of people that they will plan for in the future, get the number of housing units broken down at these income bands, which is based on best available information, and then divide up those housing needs in income bands to everybody. So there's a little bit more information to divide up. And we've provided a tool to help jurisdictions start having these conversations, and they can decide and divide up the numbers however they see fit. But we did want to provide some information to do that. So we provided, I see some questions, so.
Well, I'm just a little puzzled.
So,
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, as you know, in the county, we don't get to decide what the other jurisdictions within the county do, what the cities do. And we don't even get to decide when the cities incorporate county land and bring it in. So if there's a tool that you guys use that you think is useful for how this allocation should go, to stop that tool at the county level and not break it down by jurisdiction really seems like it's taken away a lot of information that would be useful to us.
Well, the counties, I might not have been clear. The county is expected to work with the cities to divide up the total housing needs. So it's supposed to be a collaborative process.
yeah.
And this is where I can help answer once I think we get through the background information. I had been part of that regional collaborative process,
Okay.
and so I can speak to that.
Okay,
And it has been
I
collaborative.
think this is all on the same page on that particular issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wasn't, so thanks for explaining, because I really I wasn't too clear on what you had just said, so.
Yeah, sorry, I might have said county and not said all jurisdictions work together to decide.
Got it.
Okay,
So this is a tool for the counties and cities to work
Okay.
together to make
okay,
this decision.
we'll dig into that a little deeper after you get more of this introductory stuff.
Yes. And other jurisdictions have come before you and have done this work, so there are some case studies or examples of how it's been done. And some, recommendations based on their work of how you might want to go about doing that work.
And I can say that TRPC has been the lead for our region, and before they even kicked off the work, they reached out to all those jurisdictions and brought that information to the table, and really dived into lessons learned, and so happy to provide a little bit of
Yeah.
info as well.
Yeah, it is a scary process, but it's not dissimilar to the way that the population numbers were divided up in the past. This is what has happened before in the past. You just have housing need numbers you have more detailed information to divide up instead of just number of people and number of homes. So a little more information to work with. So we've provided 2 frameworks to help communities to start having conversations, because we don't want, this is not an easy process. We want you to have something to work off of. In our tool, we provided 2 spreadsheets that walk you through 2 different ways that you could allocate growth. And I'll explain how other counties, I can explain how other counties have done this. Because you can choose one of these methods, or you can create your own method, as long as you kind of meet some minimum standards that make sure that we are being consistent with state law. So the first framework is what we call method A, focuses on new growth. This was, everyone does the same thing. So everyone takes 20% of the housing need at 80 to 120% of area median income. Everybody takes 30% of 30 to 50% area median income. Everybody takes the same percentage of the overall county need. That's one framework to go on.
Isn't everyone does the same thing, I mean, we only build market-based housing?
Yeah.
Not anymore. Well, there's plan for and then there's build. So the way that the Growth Management Act now works is that local jurisdictions are still supposed to provide the planning framework, but the private market and or nonprofits will still build the housing. Local governments aren't expected to build the housing, but they are expected to provide the framework to allow more diversity of housing to be built. Should the funding be available? Should the developers be available? Should all the stars align? And we're working to make sure all the stars align better in the future, because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Method B is focusing on the future for horizon year, so the future 20-year planning period, and says that everyone reaches the same goal. So in the future, everyone has 20% of 80 to 120% of area median income, the 20% of the county share of that income bracket housing in their jurisdiction. So we have an even smattering of incomes and types of housing that different people can afford in every jurisdiction. Those are 2 frameworks to discuss, and you may decide to go on a 3rd framework. Other counties have gone with their own method. Some have gone with method A out of expediency or just because they couldn't decide. Nobody's gone with method B yet, and that makes a lot of sense because it's a hard one to work with, but we have some guidance for how to go through those discussions. Next slide, please.
Sorry, quick question.
Oh, yeah.
Do we know the breakdown of the population? Like right now, Thurston County is 300,000 people. I think it's close to 50-50 between city and county, but do we know that?
We know that.
It's 50-50?
Well, no, I mean, like, I can get that information, but yes, that is available in the current buildable lands report.
Thanks.
So as you are using the tool to understand your housing needs and divide up your housing needs, we do have some kind of parameters, because to meet the intent of the legislature, we want to make sure that we're still working to provide that having local governments
be consistent with that best available information of projected housing needs, but still have the flexibility. So within the steps moving forward, the steps for the jurisdiction are to choose your population projection. And then the tool will translate that population projection into housing targets, so the housing income brackets. And then counties and cities get to choose the total housing needs that go. Counties and cities together, sorry, get to decide where those housing needs go. So there's flexibility in how much you think you will grow, where growth will go, and what percentage of housing income brackets go in each jurisdiction. There is not flexibility in terms of understanding what the total projected housing needs are and the breakdown of housing needs, because that directive was given specifically to Commerce.
What is PSH?
PSH, sorry, permanent supportive housing. So permanent supportive housing is typically lower income housing we've found based on data that the majority of people who are eligible for permanent supportive housing are in the 0 to 30% area median income bracket, but it's housing with services. It's those people who need a little extra support to live in their daily life. Next slide, please. Oh, so sorry. So if you're in your packet, there are some, as you have these discussions, in addition to those two frameworks that we provided in method A and method B, we do provide a variety of different considerations that you might want to discuss as you are having these conversations. For example, land capacity, where do you think that there's infrastructure for this new housing? Also, where are the jobs, where's the frequent transit, and where are the services? Where do you probably want to locate more of the housing and probably more of the affordable housing so that people can readily access their jobs and the transit and the services and the type of infrastructure that you've also put in. But you might also want to look at equity and other types of considerations. Next slide, please. Yep.
Where in this would we fit in, like, I guess maybe accessibility or equity, the idea of not close to like toxic waste sites or things, unhealthy environments, things like that?
Yeah, that could be one. That's actually not one that rose to the top, but I think that's one. And we have say the HEAL map doesn't do that. But yes, I think that's an important thing to do. You want to think about where there are areas of opportunity and where there are less desirable areas, and probably locate more housing in those areas of opportunity. So oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, Kevin, that probably fall under equity, those EJ considerations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they often are equity issues, but even everybody should never be in a toxic waste dump.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there probably already is a framework to do that, but making sure that that is consistent with, what is important for the future.
Thank you.
It's the understanding of Euclidean zoning.
Yeah. So once you've decided how you will divide up your housing need numbers, we do recommend that you create a table with your allocation in a public facing document. This shows that all of your housing needs add up to the total that are provided in the tool, and that we're planning for all of the future housing needs that we know are most likely scenario going to be the future case. Next slide, please. Now, after you've understood how much housing you need to plan for, what type of housing you need to plan for, the next step is to make sure that you have the zoning that will allow the framework for that housing to be built. Again, building housing is not within the control of a local jurisdiction. They don't typically go out and do that, but zoning is. So we need to make sure that you have the framework that you can build this type of housing that people can afford. With this step, jurisdictions previously already did this work, but they didn't take into account housing affordability. So this step for land capacity now takes into account what type of housing can meet certain people's housing needs and what housing people can reasonably afford with various types of incomes. We recommend that jurisdictions include that their portion of the countywide share of housing need
and show that there's enough capacity of housing. And we have a 6-step process that walks you through this, so it gets a little complicated and technical, so I'm not gonna go into the whole details, but we have step-by-step walkthrough instructions for the planners to work through this. If a jurisdiction finds out that they don't have the zoning framework to allow the types of housing to be built in the future, again, if people come to the table and build it, then the zoning changes do need to be done at the same time with the periodic update. There is the expectation that in addition to your comprehensive plan, your development regulations are also updated to be consistent with your comprehensive plan at the end of the periodic update cycle. So what would that mean? Skipping all the math for the land capacity analysis, because it gets pretty complicated, but it's super fascinating. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah,
I know it's super complicated, but I'm super curious and have wondered this for a long time. Can you give us a basic explanation of what is the difference in land capacity for low income versus moderate versus extremely low?
Yeah, so what we think, basically, what it's gonna look like, we have a table in our land capacity regulation, sorry, it's not in here, that equates certain types of development to the certain types of housing needs that we'll probably meet. For example, your typical 1/4 acre subdivision lot is not gonna meet the 0 to 30% area median income household need. It's probably not gonna meet the 50 to 80% area median household income need. It's probably gonna be only the 100 to 120 or 120 plus. But your moderate density housing type where you have attached housing such as duplexes, triplexes, or townhomes, which are my personal favorite, even though I don't live one right now, I have in the past. Those will probably meet incomes of 80 to 120% income housing. Your 3-story walk-up apartments can get down to 50 to 80% area median income. Sometimes you need subsidies to do that, or other funding sources to do that for the market to build it. But then you're typically looking at that higher density multifamily development to get into those lower income housing levels. Now, one of the things that I personally think is we need to get more creative at figuring out how we can meet lower income housing needs. We don't want to say everybody who has, is making less than 80% area median income should be in an apartment building. But based on what is typically built in the market today with our housing trust fund, with the private sector, that's what's affordable. So we want to get creative with that. And we think accessory dwelling units might be a way to do that. Manufactured home parks and places where that allow that. Tiny homes or micro units could be a way to do that. Cottage housing. So we're all, I think, as a society brainstorming, how do we make that work to provide housing that's more economical that meets people's needs.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
So what we think this means in terms of the land capacity is that jurisdictions may need to create more opportunities for zoning that allows for the lower income housing needs. In some jurisdictions, they are primarily single family cookie cutter 1/4 acre lots. And if we are to either take a method A or method B approach where everybody takes a little bit of housing at all the different income levels, that means that some jurisdictions are going to need to do significant changes. Some may not have to do as many changes, but we do think in some jurisdictions that there may need to be more land zone for mid-rise housing or more affordable housing types, whatever that looks like in your jurisdiction and however creative we can get in that realm. It also means that we need to take a careful look at infrastructure. So we want to probably direct growth to our urban growth areas. That's where there's infrastructure, typically services, access to jobs, access, to where our roads are. It allows people to live more affordably because the units are, the lots are smaller, but we probably need to upgrade our infrastructure and plan for the next 20 years in our capital facilities plan to make sure we can grow and put growth in those areas. And we also need to make sure that based on Celeste's comment, we also need to make sure that we are allowing these other types of housing that some jurisdictions have not always allowed, such as emergency housing, emergency shelter, and permanent supportive housing. And one of the things that Commerce is doing right now, we're actually going to be putting out an RFP in 2 weeks, is to develop a model ordinance that local governments can use and a best practices guide on how to do this work, this third bullet, how to allow these supportive housing types that some people don't think are the best neighbors, how to allow them in your community in a thoughtful and permissive way, because frankly, every community probably has a need for them. Whether it's, you know, somebody coming out of foster care or a veteran or somebody who just one medical bill away from being evicted. Every community has a need for it. Next slide, please. So once the foundation is made to allow different types of housing, the legislature also asks local governments to look at what are the other barriers to the housing need, building, to anybody coming in and building housing within their jurisdiction, because regulating land use and the types of housing that can be built is within the control of local governments. So they ask local governments to look at their housing production trends and see if they are not on track with meeting what their housing needs are as developed through this process, and then identify what those barriers are that are preventing that housing from being built and working to remove them by creating an action plan to remove those barriers. Next slide, please. In our guidance, we've actually provided a framework to help local governments work through this with some common barriers, as well as an example guide of what a jurisdiction might find as potential actions to remove the barriers to help walk through this process. And of course, Commerce staff are available to help with this. But for example, if you think that you can't build townhouses in a area that is slated for growth, or even moderate density housing like middle housing, duplex or triplexes, you might need to allow what we call unit lot subdivisions, those smaller lots. You might need to reduce the parking requirements. You might need to do proportional impact fees so that smaller units don't have to pay as much of a hookup fee as a larger unit. The variety of different tools that local governments have to help the market and help nonprofit providers build the housing that we need in the future. And this is one way to do it, is to identify those barriers and come up with an action plan to address them. And the great news about being a 2025 jurisdiction is all the 2024s will be doing this ahead of you. So you can basically look at their work and borrow it.
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge that I know I faced in thinking through all the barriers is that they are very different in a rural area, that the playbook for how to address affordable housing or housing for all income levels in an urban area has been written for a long time. In a rural area, it's going to take really creative thinking. And, you know, I think we're trying to put that effort in, but
and we're still trying to crack the nut too and try to figure that out. We actually have a meeting with the Office of Rural Farm Worker Housing in a few weeks to we're continuing to work through that issue.
Because as I look through your list, our zoning allows most of these things. We actually have fairly progressive zoning. I mean, there's definitely tweaks. That isn't the issue.
Yeah.
Community water systems, community septic systems, and
Impact fees.
impact, but like water rights, you can't get a water right for a community water system, which means you can't do a cottage development, which means you can't do a cluster development. Like those barriers are just.
I want to go to Joel first.
I just wanted to see if off the top of your head, you knew the list of the 2024 jurisdictions, so I could think of like.
So the 2024 jurisdictions are King County, Snohomish County, Kitsap, and Pierce County, and all of the cities within those counties. And the Puget Sound Regional Council actually collaborated with a whole bunch of affordable housing developers and collected barriers that are in those regions to affordable housing. It may not be as similar in the 2025 jurisdiction, so I'm happy to, if you know developers who work across your county and other counties that are 2025s, I'm happy to kind of do the same thing for jurisdictions in the 2025 group to kind of create a forum for developers, affordable housing developers, recreate and low-income housing developers to come together and say, these are the barriers to building in this environment, so that every local jurisdiction doesn't have to go through the process of interviewing their developers themselves. I just don't know all the players, so I would need a little bit of help with doing that. So I'm happy to coordinate that.
Yeah, we
You
can.
said Kings, Snohomish, Kitsap, and Pierce?
Commissioner Day, did you have something?
Yeah, so I think on this idea about it being difficult in a rural setting and maybe even irresponsible to be putting some of these housing types in. I'm looking at the Pierce County example of allocation and, you know, Bonnie Lake really took the brunt of it. DuPont, Bonnie Lake, but that.
Well, that's not a complete list.
Oh,
No Tacoma on there.
I know, but my thought is this means that like that negotiation about where the housing goes can be spread out quite a bit. Auburn, pretty much nothing, and Bonnie Lake,
Yeah,
DuPont.
so thank you for
Yeah.
bringing that up. That was one point that I neglected to mention, because I also was trying to keep to my 20-minute
Yeah.
plan, but as you have those discussions about where growth will go, we do recommend that in those allocation discussions, having a hard conversation about how much growth should go to rural areas and what type of growth should go to rural areas. Unfortunately, there's very few ways to really provide new low-income housing in rural areas because of the lot size, because of the transportation costs, and because of the types of housing that you can build there.
There's one easy way.
Change the Growth Management Act?
No,
Okay.
a lot of your HOAs are in the rural area. And HOAs have specific requirements that don't allow ADUs or other development on properties. And that's an RCW that's gotta be changed.
We have ADUs in the county.
Yeah, no,
We
so
do.
ADUs are allowed by zoning,
Yeah.
but the HOAs don't allow
They
them.
prohibit it.
So the legislature did take a hard look at that. I did see your hand. I want to come back to you. Did take a hard look at that in the last legislative cycle, and they said with the new ADU bill and the middle housing bill that HOAs can no longer create regulations that limit the type of housing that you can build on a property inconsistent with state law. Unfortunately, that doesn't impact past, but the reason they did that is because those are contractual agreements that no one has figured out how to regulate and go back on, because they are contractual relations between two different people. And I don't think the state can override those, not without a whole heck of a lot of lawsuits. So they're thinking about it, and it's one of the things that we've been a concern of ours, but
Yeah. So you're talking about a new HOA development would have to be under that. But a current HOA development that has their bylaws already filed with the state would not be.
right.
Yeah.
There is exemptions for local governments to not be held liable if they do permit accessory dwelling units or middle housing in HOAs, but then it's up to the local HOA to enforce it. And
Yeah.
I know my HOA would enforce it,
So-
unfortunately, and then they made somebody take off the roof and replace it because
Exactly.
it wasn't the right material.
I'd like
It
to
was
get
like,
over
oh
to
my-
Commissioner Wheatley.
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
In terms of gathering information to determine the barriers that exist, I know that the Puget Sound Regional Council has been trying to get the jurisdictions to talk about their experiences so far. Like I've sat in on the conversations about MFTEs. You know, like they did have a couple of conversations about kind of picking the low hanging fruit that's been done long enough ago. Is it working? And my sense was there wasn't a lot of, there's really not a lot of information. I mean, a lot of this, as much as you want to gather information, it hasn't been gathered yet. And so, it seemed like people were saying, well, it hasn't worked like we were hoping it would, or things like that. But the conversation seems like it's in its beginning phases in terms of the jurisdictions figuring out the things, whether the things they've tried have actually worked and to what degree. So there's not a lot of information there. Nonetheless, the PSRC has made an effort to do some mapping, and they've created a nice, I'm sure you've probably worked on it too, the matrix. So that which I think it's worth knowing about.
Yeah.
Not only for the planners, but for the community to know that there's a tool out there. I think it's a PSRC tool. And it's not done for this county, unfortunately, but you look at the sort of type of situation, the kind of town you're in, and then it provides you a kind of a matrix of potential solutions for that particular situation. And so I think that's a useful tool to know about. And then the third thing is one thing that I don't think there's a lot of information on, and I would love to see Commerce work on in terms of gathering information. And we've kind of touched on it here. Rural areas are a little different in a lot of ways. And one of them is that people live in rural areas because they can't afford to live in urban areas. And so if you start talking about building for low income in rural areas, you run the risk of displacement more. We need a better understanding of how displacement fits into this. I mean, we are seeing that with, this is happening statewide with the mobile home parks, having problems, getting bought out and their rents raised and things like that. There might be things jurisdictions can do to help with that. But we don't, how much do we really understand about the displacement mechanisms and how to factor those in? Because that's especially important for rural
areas. Following on to Helen's comments about, the cities and knowing the impacts of things they've already tried. There's been a lot of debate here locally around the whole missing middle thing. I see you've got slides in here about HB 1110. We've had debate amongst our own planning commission here about what we think the impacts are going to be. Some people think there's going to be lots of additional housing available from that. Some of us think not as much. I lived in Santa Monica. They implemented missing middle housing 20 years ago, and it's had very negligible impact. I'm just curious if Commerce has a stand in their modeling on what they expect missing middle to contribute to these housings for any areas over 6,000 population.
In my view, I don't think there's gonna be a big change. It does depend on the housing market, and there is kind of a framework that we recommend jurisdictions could use to determine how much uptake there might be on middle housing, and it considers the type of housing and the property value versus home value versus lot value. And that's a framework to do it. But what we've seen in other jurisdictions, for example, in Minneapolis, there hasn't been much uptake. So then again, in Seattle, there's been big uptake. So if you have a hot market, you'll see more. If you don't have a hot market, you're probably not going to see a lot yet.
Thank you.
I wanted to kind of piggyback a little bit on what Commissioner Day was talking about, how our county and our commission has had a lot of discussions about keeping rural and a disgust for sprawl, to the point that even one home per 5 acres at times seems like that's a little too sprawlish, and there are some real environmental impacts just from that. And this feels like it's really going to push sprawl, and it's going to accelerate sprawl, especially if there is not a mechanism where we can go to the urban jurisdictions and say, you need to take on this 0 to 100% housing allocation stuff. I mean, we could still do 1 in 5s. We probably prefer to do 1 in 10s out here, but we could still do 1 in 5s. But to even think that we're going to be putting duplex or other multifamily in the unincorporated areas of the county, I mean, we don't have the water for it. We don't have the septic for it. How are we going to get these cities to say, yeah, we're going to, and we just did a bunch of joint plans where the cities are like, we're giving out as many permits for apartments as we can, and it's still not going to be enough.
But they're still not willing to incorporate some of the urban.
Well, there's a whole nother discussion there. These cities need to start gobbling up the UGAs. That's for sure. That's a real bone of contention for me.
It's a bone of contention because it's costly for
Yes.
them to put in septic and water and utilities. And that's their biggest problem with it.
So how are we going to have these conversations where we don't have a carrot nor a stick to tell the cities that they need to take on the bulk of this? And most of the density needs to be in the urban areas anyways. That's where the services are, especially when it comes to permanent supportive housing or emergency housing or something like that. You're not going to put a homeless camp out in the middle of the forest somewhere because there's not a bus line. There's not any other services or not jobs. There's nothing like
Lucky
that.
to get cell phone coverage.
No. So I guess I'd like to know what the presumed carrots and sticks are for getting the jurisdictions on board for taking on most of the burden that this is going to impose.
I think that one of the important things is coming to the table of these conversations at TRPC with your existing land capacity information. So for example, how much capacity do you have in your urban growth areas, not in your unincorporated or outside of the urban growth areas, in your urban growth areas where you're still planning for growth, what is your capacity?
Well,
Not including capacity outside of there. And then also what types of housing can you realistically build with the types of infrastructure and services and jobs that are available in those areas? And then come to the table with that and say, what do you have? And then hopefully there'll be.
well, I think that kind of goes back to what Commissioner Prestinger was saying, because when we see things like missing middle or infill or something like that, it doesn't really happen. We don't. see-
Excuse me, pardon me, can you all hear me?
No,
Yes.
ma'am, this is not we're not taking any more public comment at this particular point.
Well, unfortunately, none of the chat messages are being
That's okay.
responded
If
to.
we don't take any more public comment other than during the public comments period of the meeting.
Can someone check the chat messages and respond to them? Or is there a time that that's done?
I don't know what to say. No, we're not going through any of the chat messages at this point. So again, we go back to how do we, if the city says, well, we have missing middle policies and we have infill policies and that kind of stuff, that's what's going to take care of it, but it's not going to get realized. And if the county's just like, well, I guess we're going to have to start building apartment complexes out in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't make any sense.
With no sewer systems or water systems or.
I think this question goes back to Ashley. How are you gonna get
Yeah.
everybody to do
How do we
that?
how do we get the other jurisdictions on board with adding to capacity?
I do think they are taking it.
I believe that they're sincere in wanting to do it, but I don't know how much they can do it.
So I want to make sure Laura has an opportunity to get through the rest of the presentation. I do have a
Okay,
bit I can share,
Okay,
but I
we'll,
don't wanna.
we'll quit shotgunning
Just
for
wanna
you for a
make
bit, let you
sure.
get through the presentation
Yeah,
and we'll
there's
come
gonna
back.
be some
to
hard
this.
conversations. And
Yeah.
I recommend coming to the table through land capacity information to inform those.
Okay,
All right, next slide, please. So in addition to all of the stuff that we've covered already, the legislature also directed local governments to take a look at racially disparate impacts in their regulations. And what we recommend that the policies, one of the things that we recommend jurisdictions do is follow kind of a 5-step process, which starts with understanding who's in your community and understanding what the data says. So understanding, do you have racially disparate impacts and exclusion in your jurisdiction that you might need to therefore then look at your policies and begin to change things? And most jurisdictions will find that. Then the starting framework is to evaluate and revise the policies that may have led to that or create policies that prevent that from happening in the future. And then develop regulations that then support those policies to make sure that there's a framework in place to prevent future displacement from happening. And one of the pieces that jurisdictions will need to do in response to Commissioner Wheatley is that jurisdictions will need to identify areas at risk of displacement. And we have developed a statewide displacement risk map. It's not perfect because it only gets down to such a certain level of detail, but we are happy to work with you to understand if there's other places where you need more detail and understanding displacement risk so that you can develop policies. But the key thing of all of this is to develop, next slide, please. To review your policies to see if there are any policies and that are contributing to these disparate impacts. Who is benefiting and burdening from your policies? Is there any language that is contributing to exclusion in your communities? There could be if you have any policies that particularly encourage or enforce certain types of housing development that are more inclusive. Are there certain policies that may create more displacement risk? So evaluating your policies, and we recommend not only evaluating your housing policies, but all of your policies and your whole comprehensive plan, because your infrastructure policies have a big impact on your housing. Although it's not required, we do recommend that. And then revising your policies and then taking the next steps to implement regulations and programs that will help to address this. So a lot of this you'll be able to do in terms of the zoning framework that you do, you'll be able to address and reverse exclusion and potentially displacement if you have some and disparate impacts if you change your zoning. But there are also other programs that you might want to look at addressing, such as providing information on resources to those who might be at risk of displacement, or creating better renter policies to prevent eviction. We have a whole suite of recommendations based on the type of policies that you may or may not develop in your comprehensive plan to begin to address and undo these disparate impacts. And there's about 20 different, like 30 different frameworks for doing that. And one of the things that I'm also working on right now is specifically compiling recommendations to address displacement in particular. So we did a grant program where jurisdictions were required to look at develop displacement policies and regulations, and I'm compiling those and a document that jurisdictions can then use for their comprehensive plan. Next slide. So in summary, jurisdictions will work between the county and the cities to allocate the housing needs that come from our housing tool, the Housing for All planning tool, zone to make sure that they are accommodating the housing affordable to all of the housing needs that they have come up this determined based on that allocation process, planning for that infrastructure so that that new housing can be built. And that's one thing that we're hearing again and again. It's really hard to do. So we're trying, one of the things that we're going to be looking at is what research can we do to help local jurisdictions do that planning, and what information can we help provide in that sense for infrastructure. Identify those barriers, because it's not only zoning that is creating those barriers to building, it's other regulations, and creating that action plan to address them, and then creating policies and regulations to undo that exclusionary zoning and those disparate impacts. The next slide is going into the regulatory update. So I did want to pause here and see if there's any comments or questions before I move on to the more regulatory updates.
I did have a question maybe for Ashley more than you. Sure. What is the, what is it called? For Thurston County, roughly, what is the area median income?
Oh, I have it somewhere. Let me look it up while she's going through.
Thought Thurston was 83 per house.
Yeah, it's around 80.
It's
83, does that sound right?
It's around 80.
yeah, those numbers do not stick in my head. I apologize. But I did bring some resources to look things up, so. I can look
And
that
if you
up.
go to the HUD income.
The mean is very different than the median.
I'm sorry?
Here in Thurston County, the mean is very different than the median.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to know what the AN, if we're going by the ANI, I want to know what that is, and I'm sure the public does too.
The M and AMI.
So I have a table that breaks it down by each income level, and I'd be happy to go through.
Well, yeah, as long as we know, for our listeners, is, not just for us, but for the public, I think that's an important number to know.
Yeah, it's the 82,000 is
80.
sort of that's the 80%. The 100% is 102,500 is what TRPC is using for planning purposes.
All right, accessory dwelling units. As you all probably aware, in 2023, the legislature passed HB 1337 and now requires that local governments, both cities and counties, allow 2 accessory dwelling units in all urban growth areas on every lot. That can be attached and detached, just detached, or actually, I think it has to be 1 attached, 1 detached, but there's a little flexibility there. In addition to that, that's a big piece of it. Jurisdictions may not require owner occupancy. They have to allow the independent sale, which means that local residents may condoize basically their lot and sell off the actual physical ADU. And not the property, but the ADU. And there are also some new limitations to what parking regulations you can have on accessory dwelling units. The other thing is that you can no longer charge more than 50% of the impact fees that are charged for the principal unit. So when someone builds a new ADU, they only have to pay half of the typically hookup fees.
For each one or for both?
I think it would be for each one.
Okay.
Are there any rules about are they allowed to make any rules around they can or cannot Airbnb type thing it?
I don't think so.
Short-term rental rules?
Yeah.
I don't think that was a part of it.
And the biggest barrier to that and the county, even a UGA, is gonna be septic, because it's an additional bedroom. And so it's not necessarily the impact fees.
Yeah, so
They're
if you
gonna be a
have-
barrier. It's
If you
gonna
have
be
a
septic.
small enough house and it doesn't cover the septic field, you could probably build an ADU.
They're not usually sized, they're
It's
they're
not-
sized by the number of bedrooms, so if you have one that's only
Small
built to
house,
accommodate
yeah,
3
small
bedrooms to add an additional bedroom.
Got it, yeah.
You will have to actually put in a new septic system, which is 50 grand, or could be 50 grand plus.
So you're probably not gonna see a lot of new ADUs
I mean, I
in
think
certain areas.
where we're seeing them is that they're being incorporated at the front end when someone builds a new house,
Yeah.
they're accommodating that in the planning of their septic system, but I don't know how many conversions.
And that
we
could
see.
also be a thing where you regulate that new construction, build a septic system that accommodates
accommodate.
for it. So that all new construction from now on has the opportunity to do it. It basically builds in the infrastructure with it. We have a whole guidance document on accessory dwelling units on our website, on our middle housing website. We do recommend that in unincorporated jurisdictions that when accessory dwelling units are allowed, that they either be attached or clustered with the primary unit to limit impacts. The Growth Management Hearings Board recently settled a case with Snohomish County on that, where they basically said ADUs are acceptable in unincorporated areas, but we still think that attached and or clustered meets the intent of preserving rural character and limits the impacts of sprawl and jurisdictions. However, you may limit them as much as you feel is necessary outside of urban growth areas.
See the MRSC logo, is that part of Department of Commerce?
No, it is, they were contracted to help us with this guidance because we didn't have enough staff in-house to do it. But they're a great resource for if you don't know about them. Next slide, please. 1110 also passed, which allows says that jurisdictions over a certain size have to allow middle housing, that this applies to 77 cities across the state. In Thurston County, it only applies to Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater. In those jurisdictions, because of their size, they need to allow 2 units on all lots. They can use accessory dwelling units to meet that requirement, so but they still must allow 6 of 9 types of middle housing on the lots within their jurisdiction, and allow 4 units per lot in areas of quarter-mile of transit, and 4 lots if one of the units is affordable. There's lots more on that, but since that probably doesn't apply as much, happy to answer questions after. Next slide, please. There are also other housing bills, a lot of these passed in 2023 that may be of interest. I maybe didn't list them in order of what I think might be of interest to you, but on the top one, 5258, jurisdictions now need to adopt proportional impact fees for new housing units. So based on the impact of the unit, you need to implement impact fees that are proportional. So a larger unit pays larger impact fees, a smaller unit pays less impact fees, which makes a lot of sense. Cities have to allow that unit lot subdivision that I mentioned. Counties aren't required to, but you certainly may. And it also, that allows the subdivision of lots and sometimes allows for more flexibility in subdivision of lots and development of lots that wouldn't otherwise be allowed. jurisdictions need to allow the conversion of existing commercial buildings to residential. They need to have clear and objective design standards, so the design standards should no longer go to a design review board. They need to be clear, and anybody should be able to look at them and interpret them and then apply them. And they should also be able to be determined administratively. You can still have one public hearing, but you are only limited to one public hearing. Local governments now can surplus property for affordable housing at discounted prices. And religious properties, that's a cities only. And 5058 is pretty small. There are other bills that are not specifically housing related that I thought might be of interest. Climate bill, landlords are now allowed to have any new development or redevelopment so long as there is existing infrastructure and services. So they can't have really large retail, but they can have any other use or size of building, which they previously were not allowed to have, so long as there's infrastructure. So we do recommend in unincorporated growth areas, or the unincorporated county concentrating growth, particularly in your urban growth areas, and if possible in your landlords, and not so much anywhere else. There's UGA swaps provisions, which are very complicated and
But fairly relevant to some of the discussions that
Okay.
this planning commission has been having,
Oh, great.
particularly the city of Lacey. They have large areas of the UGA that they don't think they'll be able to serve in the next 50 to 100 years in some cases. And so in terms of adding that tool to the toolbox might actually be helpful for both Lacey and even parts of Tumwater, because they're working through a habitat conservation plan. So
oh, great. We have a one pager on that on our website.
yeah,
Retail on.
there isn't, it'd be great if we weren't the first jurisdiction to utilize it, but we might end up being the first jurisdiction to utilize it.
Well, to be determined if any of the 2024s are. I know Pierce County was looking at some urban growth boundary changes, which would technically mean they have to do a swap, so I don't know.
That would be nice. We'll let them go first.
Yeah. And we are happy to provide technical assistance. We do have a planner who's more of an expert in that Steve Davenport, I can refer you to him. And then also there'll need to be changes to permit processing where you need to hold to there's the changes improve clarity for timelines for complete permit applications. And after a certain point, jurisdictions need to start reporting their permitting information to the Department of Commerce. So that technically all jurisdictions were supposed to publish it on the website anyways. I don't think anybody really does that, just to create more transparency for the public and also builders so that they can know how long it's going to take, because they will probably go to those where the permitting times are lower, as long as the other market factors are the same.
Find that in Thurston County.
To highlight our 20-year process.
Yeah.
Question, if we can go back to HB 110.
Sure.
Just to clarify, you said something about with the 2-unit requirement, one of them can be an ADU, is that correct?
ADUs are one of the type of middle housing technologies, I think. I'm pretty sure. I think that's what we determined in our guidance. I can circle back with you to clarify that.
And then I'm curious because I saw original debate over this, but I didn't see the end product. Do you feel like that bill ended up undermining or causing problems for works that planning commissions do? You know, avoidance of SEPA things, avoidance of other requirements, avoidance of GMA, et cetera? Or do you feel like it addressed a lot of those ultimately?
I don't know if the ADU did bill.
Middle housing bill.
Oh, middle housing bill. Yeah, the middle housing bill definitely complicated things.
Doesn't it kind of sidestep a lot of the stuff we do?
Yes, it was a more statewide mandate because I think the legislature felt that local governments weren't doing enough.
Right.
Even though they will have to do some pretty significant changes with 1220.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. We also have a whole bunch of resources on our website. If you ever want to check something out, we also have some communication tools with some really cool videos about why we need more housing. Of course, all of you know that, but if you're ever talking with somebody and want to know more. And we have a more detailed guide on the recent housing laws called our 2019 to 2023 housing laws, in case you want more detail than what I gave you today. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
I
Yes.
just wondered, a public opinion survey on housing, what was the general opinion?
More people are interested in moderate density housing types and housing choice. There were still maybe about 30% of people who weren't necessarily for it, 30 to 40% who weren't necessarily for it, but weren't against it. There was about 10 to 15% that were against it typically, statewide. It's really interesting.
I think it was a fascinating study, because again, I saw it when the PSRC talked it. It's too bad Thurston County wasn't one of the granular
Oh, yeah.
survey areas. It would have been so great if it had been, but it wasn't. But I think it'd be great if we could all be sent a link to that, maybe, because I think it's very informative and interesting. I had a couple questions if I could.
Yeah, please do.
ask. One of them was going back to the racially disparate impacts and the tool that you're developing. Because, you know, I'm sitting here going, yeah, this is what I was talking about with Grand Mound, you know, all of this stuff. I kept saying this was happening, and I was trying to get us to start using it on the Grand Mound UGA issue. But how granular is the information? Because what I was looking at for Grand Mound was basically census tract level. Is that about how granular it is?
Yes, I believe it's census tract.
Okay.
Although I get census tract and block mixed up, whichever's the
Well,
larger of the
census
two.
block, yeah, I was looking at census block level. or
Whichever's the
is-
larger of the two, I'm sorry. I should
Yeah,
know
whichever
this.
the smaller one is, I was looking at for Grand Mound, and I really, you know, it's like we could have talked about what it showed us about where people were living, what their ethnicity was, and it would have been really helpful. So I'm glad that tool is being developed, and I hope we use it.
Yeah, we also at Commerce have access to a tool called Policy Map, which provides a lot more granular information than we have on our displacement risk map, and we're happy to work with you or your staff to provide that additional level of information.
Yeah, I hope that going forward, when we're doing UGA planning and so forth, that we really get in the practice of incorporating as much of this map data as we can. Because, I mean, at the very least, we had the disparate health impacts mapping, and that was somewhat useful, but you know, when you dug down into the kind of the racially disparate impacts, there are some interesting things. There are some things you don't I mean, in some cases, it's sort of not what you would expect, but you know, if you look at places like Lacey, I think it's very helpful information, and I hope we get in the practice of using it for the county too. Because the county, I mean, we've been talking about how it's you know, it's important to provide services to low income people and all of that, but we have to keep in mind what the rural economy is, you know, and so things are not going to work quite the same way in terms of trying to protect affordable housing for people in rural areas. And then this is a really kind of I'm just interested in knowing what people are thinking about. Like, okay, so you've got this, you know, you've got this breakdown of how the housing should be distributed in order to be equitable. And that it looks to me, I mean, you know, I'm not that great at math, but it looks like about 3/4 of the housing needs to be under that 80% of AMI, 3/4 of it.
A lot.
And we're not gonna get the market to do that. So my question is, just generally, are people talking about what happens if you know, like what if all the land is going to market rate housing? I mean, is there a way to zone or do something that puts the brakes on that to preserve the space for what 80% of the housing should be, or 75% of the housing should be. Or what, you know, like half of it should, you know, for half the population, it's like sub 30% or something. I mean, like when you know, start looking at the numbers, you realize those are not people who are gonna be built for.
Yeah,
You can, you know, you can do so much to prevent displacement. But then how do you preserve that space so that somebody doesn't come in and build market rate housing there?
There's a few different points that I think to that. I think any new housing, as long as it's of, you know, a minimum density, is something that's gonna be good, because eventually that will filter down. So providing new, to a certain degree.
Do we have data on that? That can, does
There
Commerce
is an
have
article
data?
that filtering eventually creates more affordable housing, but generally we just need more housing too.
More housing everywhere is sort of what the regional planning directors was
Yeah.
like in every income bracket, at least for Thurston County.
Yeah, so that's part of the
More of it
puzzle. I
everywhere.
think preserving existing affordable housing.
Yeah.
I think preserving existing affordable housing is gonna be key, because if we lose that existing affordable housing, then we have to replace it and it's gonna be a lot more expensive to do so.
Okay.
And then the third tier is incentivizing more affordable housing. What can you do to help private market and or nonprofits get there to build that more affordable housing? And one of those tools may be inclusionary zoning, but you also have to be very careful with that, because it can dissuade the market.
Okay, so is there a tool that the county can use to map the affordable housing so that it knows what areas kind of need to be protected from displacement?
I don't know that we
From-
have any data on that. I know Olympia is gonna be passing a rental ordinance where they have to register. That might be something that would be a good idea, is to understand how much those are renting for.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that we've been wrestling with, you know, in Thurston County, is this is always just gonna be changing, that this is a snapshot in time. But there's gonna be shifts of your housing stock, you know, across all these income levels continuously. And so unless you have just more of everything everywhere, it's like the monitoring, tracking, all of that isn't really reflected in the bill. And what the expectations are, you know, because to Commissioner Day's point, we don't have a baseline even of the affordability of the units that are out there already, let alone tracking into the future.
And it is something that we at Commerce are thinking about how to do that. It's a big effort. One of the things that we will be doing is a rental registry study. What would it take to do a statewide rental registry study? And as part of that, I think they're going to be looking at how do we get information on what the costs are in different places. Some of the King County jurisdictions have developed a map to predict, to research and predict where naturally occurring affordable housing is. It's quite extensive. It was quite a tool. But as I mentioned, Policy Map does have some of that information. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but it basically aggregates some of the census information to kind of identify where different income populations are more likely to live.
Are you
and
using
different
any of
areas.
the commercially available sites like Zillow and stuff like that to monitor things?
Monitoring, we're still figuring out how to best monitor, and I think it's best done at the local level, because you do it best, but again, it's something we're trying to think about, but it's a massive undertaking, can be a massive.
Because most of your real estate offices anymore have companies that manage properties, and they got a real good handle on what the rental rates are in particular areas.
One
right?
software program rules them all.
I do want to get to Commissioner Pessinger's question though.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. They get harder as they go. First one's easy. On slide 5, you've got this great breakdown and you even talked about 91,000 emergency housing beds. Is there any research or data on how many mental health facility beds are needed?
Not, we did do, I don't know if we did a study on that particular term. We did do a study on how many units of housing were needed for intellectually disabled individuals. I don't have that number on the top of my head, but I can get it to you because they did do a study for the legislature this past year. But a portion of both the emergency housing and, a portion of the PSH needs, permanent supportive housing needs would be those. So it's somewhere less than 122,000. But I don't know what portion, but DSHS might have that information too.
To piggyback on his question there, are we really thinking that only 4 residents in the county is going to need an emergency housing bed?
So the emergency housing bed is on top of all of the other housing needs. And it is the way we determine that number, and this is if we do not build the housing that you see on that slide, we will need 91,000 emergency housing.
In a
beds.
county that has 389,000 people, we're gonna need 91.
This is the statewide number.
Oh,
Statewide.
okay.
Yeah, here in Thurston County, it's about 3,600 permanent supportive housing and between 900, 950 for emergency.
So still a little over 1%, or right about 1%.
It's a big number considering that there isn't a lot out there today where a lot of the other things you're building on stuff you already have.
What's that?
1/3 of 1%, right? 1,000.
I just want to say, I mean, in terms of these, like what makes sense, like, or intuitive sense, I forget the exact figure, but when I looked at that housing survey, the statewide one that I think we should all look at, one of the fine grained questions was, have you couch surfed in the last, I forget what time frame it was. You would be amazed at the
Yeah.
percentage that said yes. It was a very surprisingly large percentage.
Sorry for
Something like
interrupting.
5%.
Chair, thank you.
I can't remember. It was maybe not, it's a long time ago, but it was really high.
Last 2 questions kind of go together, and this is big picture. What have you observed for Washington counties and jurisdictions that have been the most aggressive in working towards housing at all income levels so far?
Allowing all variety of housing types in areas where it's suitable to do so. Reducing and doing so by right. So removing conditional use processes. Looking at removing those barriers, wherever they are in their local jurisdiction. And I think one of the things that, in addition to those 2 pieces, is going to be key is looking at how to incentivize development. It's one thing that we haven't really, most jurisdictions haven't quite figured out. So I kind of put a panel together at Housing Washington about local jurisdictions who are doing that. And I'm pulling together examples of how jurisdictions are going to incentivize development, because I think in addition to just allowing development and removing the barriers, incentivizing it is going to be a key thing too.
Yeah.
And now some of those more progressive jurisdictions are really looking at inclusionary zoning and at what point it makes sense to do so and when it doesn't impede the market from building housing.
What do you call it, zoning?
Inclusionary zoning is when you require projects of a certain size to dedicate a certain portion or to preserve a certain portion of the units as affordable. So for example, in Seattle, I forget what the number is, right? Yeah, so I don't think it's personally, I don't think it's terribly successful unless it's done on a regional basis, but it can be a very powerful tool.
That was actually my second question. The first one was about which specific counties or
Which specific
jurisdictions were
counties?
doing these things.
King County is doing a lot. Snohomish is looking at doing a lot. They haven't adopted a lot at the moment in terms of cities. Redmond and Bellevue and Anacortes and Langley to a little bit, and Port Angeles, Olympia. Depends on the
They've
type
been
of thing.
talking about those numbers, about the breakdowns for years in Olympia, and they've already calculated they have more than 100% of need for 100+% AMI.
What do you mean?
They have more than 100% capacity. They don't need
Oh,
additional
yeah.
housing that's at market price. They need everything at 80% or below.
I think Redmond found that too, or Redmond or Bellevue, one
You
of
said
them
Redmond,
found that
Bellevue,
virtually
Port
everything
Angeles.
needed to be.
I think it's Port Angeles. I get Port Angeles. Yeah, Port Angeles has been doing some neat work. Olympia, Tacoma.
Thank you.
Commissioner Day, did you have a question?
I guess for me, it's like you mentioned incentivizing builders and things like that, but in the county, it seems like, but they're not gonna take that on for the infrastructure and the transportation, those types of things. So my question is the state, is there a provision to help with funding to do some of that infrastructure things that in the county especially, that we need to get in before we can do any kind of substantial building?
There are some programs, typically they are, A, they're very competitive, and B, they also tend to prioritize those jurisdictions or those areas where it serves lower income segments, so typically under 80% AMI. So if there are some locations where that is the predominant beneficiary, they could be competitive. Just apply early and often for them. It's gonna be kind of one of those things that I think we're all collectively gonna have to figure out, how do we get the infrastructure in? But I hear that even from the wealthy jurisdictions that, you know, in King County, like they're having trouble with it. So one of the things that we have done recently at Commerce is develop what we call our CHIP program, Connecting Housing to Infrastructure Program, which specifically funds affordable housing development, the infrastructure for affordable housing development, and hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. And that infrastructure could benefit other areas if it were to do so. But again, that's one of the things that we're gonna have to research. Is there any way that we can, you know, a local government can go in and get a loan from the Public Works Board and build it, and then have people as they to build infrastructure, and then come in and people pay latecomer fees so that it's the city's money is recouped? Or can they do a tax increment financing area where in an area, a commercial area that you might want to do mixed use, you take some of the revenue from taxes to offset the infrastructure costs? Now, unfortunately, that's a new bill and nobody in Washington has really done that. I think we're gonna have to get creative. But there are some ways, and I'm happy to point you to them. I think we have a list in an appendix in one of our documents on.
One of the incentives that the planning commission explored as part of a recent project looking at agriculture zoning was using the density bonus tool. We used to have one here in Thurston County. It was fairly effective in our plan developments, and you know, could be even more effective if you start weaving in things like affordable housing and whatnot. We were challenged though that and essentially took out density bonuses because we weren't preserving rural aesthetic. But I was wondering if there's anything in
Well,
there any other
bonuses
counties?
are a tool that a lot of jurisdictions use. We're using it in outside of the urban growth area, or?
It was actually, it was a conservation tool. So it was, how do you incentivize conservation subdivisions? And because they're on community water systems, you could accommodate more density than you could if you're just doing like one house per acre. And it was like, how do you maximize the use of an infrastructure piece of
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, well, and I guess we were hoping to revisit it, coming at it from not just conservation of land for habitat farming or whatever, but also as an affordable housing tool. Because to your point about like, we'll have septic systems sized to accommodate future ADUs. Well, how do we, I mean, for the county, this would be multi-benefit outcome of conserving land, being able to accommodate more units, not have to do additional offsets for single family.
Yeah,
You
I
might
think
have a
that's,
Clean Water Act preemption of the GMA on that issue. And it might be worth litigating.
Just trying to throw some
Yeah, no,
creative
I think
ideas out there of like,
density bonuses in urban growth areas are definitely something to
this
look
is
at.
outside.
Outside, I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, that is low impact development, and you actually have a responsibility as a jurisdiction with an NPDS permit to allow that, and that would preempt the Growth Management Act. Because it's a Clean Water Act.
I don't know if this is in, well, I'm sure it's not in your wheelhouse, but one of the other challenges that we have is that if we are trying to add some of this middle housing with ADUs or something like that, and we do run into a septic system issue, you know, right now, all our septic system, we use bedrooms as a proxy for how much use that septic system is using. And we could change that methodology, you know, in commercial units, they count appliances as the proxy, and that's probably a little closer, but nobody actually does a study to see how much. We don't even, well, we kind of take soil types into account to a certain degree, but not as much as we should. But on a state level, we need to change how we treat septic systems and how many units it can support, because I think we'd be able to, there's a lot of 1,000-gallon septic tanks out there that really could support 1 or 2 ADUs, but we're not allowed to do it.
In mobile home, I mean, my
Yeah,
own parents are in a mobile home park in the county and they're on septic. You
Yeah.
know, and with new septic systems going in to support.
I can bring that up. We have an interagency working group and I can ask some of the people from DOH about that.
yeah.
Is it DOH that does the?
Was it DOH that told us that? We just touched that briefly 2 years ago in one of our topics, and I think it was when we were doing the ADU update for the county. And we were hoping to do that, and somebody at the state said, no, you can't do that. Because we have to use the bedroom proxy instead of the appliance proxy or an actual water use study.
And it, trying to eliminate conditional uses, one of the, I mean, it's not a conditional use permit, it's the reasonable use exception in the critical areas ordinance, but there are no exceptions for septic systems or in the critical areas ordinance. So even if the use is outright permitted, if you go and try to put in a new septic system and it is anywhere within a critical area buffer, you essentially get yourself locked into a hearings examiner review that's very costly.
And I think we did also just learn during the Lacey joint plan update that, we can only have 3 units per acre on septic anyways because of minimum square footage, lot square footage of 12,500 feet per lot. So you can't even, if you're down to 1 in 3 zoning is basically all you can do and keep it on septic unless you change that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about Lacey, our conversation with Lacey too, because you were talking about Tanglewild and your frustration about it.
Should have
It's
been
kind of-
incorporated.
Yeah.
Right, and the answer from one of the Lacey members was, well, who's gonna pay for the conversion of the septic? And it seems to me, I mean, that's where gathering information from the actual community is really important to understand what the barriers are. And, for us, it might make sense to chase after money to help people convert to being on the sewer system in order to achieve the density goals. So, it's not something that you automatically think of.
Sewer will never go outside UGA. You'll never see sewer
Yeah.
in unincorporated.
Right, but that was the issue with Tanglewild, because it's sort of it's one of those little jurisdictions that's in the middle of like one of the major, planned growth corridors. But it would displace people who cannot afford, it comes up against the affordability issue because it would displace people who couldn't afford to make that transition to sewer. So.
We just print up a lot of signs that say if it's yellow, let it mellow. Down. I quickly just want to state thank you very much for your work on this. Thank you for this presentation. I think this is incredibly important to us, and for many people, I thought this was going to be one of the most informative presentations of the year. Thank you.
And I think we're really going to be hitting the housing portion of our update in about 10 months is when we start on that. Is that right?
I mean, I think it's gonna come up as we discuss a lot of the
Yeah.
other elements. I mean, and one of the reasons that we invited Laura to come is that housing allocation piece. We can't really even kick off our consultant doing work until that piece is, locked down, because every other piece builds on it in terms of our land capacity analysis and whatnot. And so I know that there was a slide that said, here are all the different things you can take into consideration. In a lot of cases, we don't have the data to support taking those things into consideration, or we just don't have the time because we're all kicking off our comp plan updates.
Well, maybe this is moving into our next agenda item. I'm not really sure, but how are the negotiations going with the other jurisdictions about this allocation distribution? Because that kind of needs to be done too before we really can decide what we're doing.
So we have come to a general agreement And
Olympia good, Lacey not so good.
oh, no. I really appreciate Laura sort of walking through the method A, method B. We all looked at them as well. Method A, the biggest challenge is for a city like Olympia, you get no credit for the good work that you might have done over the last 10, 20 years. Method B, though, which does allow you to give credit, also you end up with negative numbers. Because in
Which-
some cases.
Yeah, which Snohomish County figured out. They basically took,
They took the best of both.
yeah, they took the best of both.
Well, which is what, after reviewing all the other counties, we, because basically did case studies of all the other counties and talked to them. King had the best data sets. It was also super complex. They had an advisory group they were able to pull together, which was amazing. And what they said was they tried to put all these different inputs in and it didn't move the needle hardly at all. And so their advice to us was, yeah, when there's more time, maybe play around with this, but we're here to tell you, we tried a lot of different iterations and it didn't really change the distribution that much. Spend your time doing something else. Snohomish seemed to find a sweet spot. Pierce County, they had to do a lot of updates to their underlying buildable lands, like housing unit projections and population projections, and they said they ran out of time. They picked method A. Kitsap, I think, was leaning toward method A, if I recall
Kitsap
correctly.
decided to do method A.
It's the simplest one to explain.
Who makes that decision in Thurston County?
It'll be TRPC. So the regional council will be reviewing a technical memorandum. I have in front of me drafts, so I could try to answer questions. They're not finalized. There is going to be a presentation. TRPC is coming and going to be presenting to our board. I think it's December 7th. I can lock down that date and send it to you. And then my hope is to loop back and follow up on this with a separate presentation. Probably won't have TRPC here, but I'll try to glean as much as I can from Michael and walk through that. But I'm happy to answer the questions I can. We definitely, as a region, talked about that allocation to rural unincorporated. And there wasn't really a good way to divvy it up any differently than just picking sort of this hybrid of take the best of method A and take the best of method B. So you'd still end up with an allocation and rural unincorporated. I think folks also thought it was important that there are people that want to live in rural areas that still need affordable housing, especially if you think about South Thurston County. Like we're very urban in the north, but if you live in South Thurston County, there really isn't an urban option other than, Yelm is definitely becoming more urbanized. And so, ensuring that we had affordable housing in places like Grand Mound, west of Grand Mound and the Rainier Tenino corridors. But they were very friendly, collaborative discussions. I think our jurisdictional partners, they think the work is really important and we're gonna take our best shot this go around, and recognizing that, we get to monitor and come back and make improvements.
Also, Island County, I don't know if they interviewed Island County, they have a lot of unincorporated area and they have done a custom allocation. It might be worth seeing if they reached out to have them and just looking at what they did. I couldn't, unfortunately, I don't have the file that they showed me at their meeting a few weeks ago, but it might be of interest.
Okay, yeah, and I think Lewis shared theirs at a WASAC conference I was at, and they picked method A.
Well, they
with a
actually
few
did
changes.
Yeah, they basically took method A and then forced growth, and particularly the lower income housing needs from the unincorporated area to their urban corridor, based on what capacity they had. So they did a custom, more growth towards the center.
Makes sense. All right, well, does anybody have any more questions for Laura before we let her go home?
I told you they were engaged.
It's great. I'm so happy to be here and
Really
answer
glad that you
questions.
showed up, yeah.
I hope I was able to answer. If I wasn't able to answer any of your questions, can you pass
Of
them along
course.
to me? Or my email is also on the presentation and it's also on our website. So
Maybe
free to
we'll be
call
able
me
to
or
drag you
anything.
back again in 6 months or a year or something and talk about this some more. Maybe.
Great, yeah, happy to come.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're gonna move on to the next related section, section on Thurston 2045, which is the update on housing allocation methodology. And I think Anna's gonna do that one, right?
Oh, that was essentially the update I was just giving you.
There's nothing more to it than that?
Unless you have specific questions. I mean, I can answer your question
Surprise.
regarding the split. Right now, it is about 50-50. I can answer the question in terms of what percentage of the projected housing units fall under that 80% AMI, and it's about 55% of all the new housing units.
About what?
55%,
55% here in Thurston County.
Sub what?
80% or lower.
80% or lower. One of the things that was really surprising for us, which isn't captured in the HAPT tool, but the remainder, which TRPC just assumed remainder would be over the 120% AMI. And there was a big shortage in Thurston County in that bracket.
You're kidding me.
No,
I would never have guessed that.
we were all shocked. It was probably the biggest shocker. We're like, why is that number so big? But it was big.
Well, if you think about half of the people are over 100%.
Yep.
So if you don't have a lot of renters that you're limiting cost burning for, there could be a lot up there.
Yeah, so it was, of the total number of units, around that 55,000, 16,000 plus were in that upper bracket.
When the county thinks about how they're going to serve this lower portion of it, the 80% and lower, what housing types is the county thinking that they're gonna focus on? We're gonna focus on
I mean, I think what I would like to
Sheds.
see, many sheds.
sheds and buses.
So the referencing like Island County, San Juan County, like they do have rural models for affordable housing. If you look up, I should share a screen,
The cottages.
Lopez Island Land Trust Developments. They have managed to, what I think like is implement a rural type, like a rural topology for affordable housing. And so Anna and one of the other members of the team, Brian Benjamin, who you may recall, they're gonna be essentially contacting Orcas, Orcas Island Land Trust and Lopez Island Land Trust to do a case study. And then following up with the county to see like, how did you accomplish that on the ground? What are the funding mechanisms? How is it served with utilities? What kind of provisions did the county have in place to support that? But, so that's one. I mean,
Would we be allowed to do a zoning that's like just for Habitat for Humanity?
I'd be on board for that.
well, so I know that DNR, I know, Aiden's, that's great. DNR is looking at, selling surplus property for affordable housing, and that would be more in rural areas, I would presume.
They're actually
Not
looking at one of Lazy.
Oh, and one in
Not
Lacey,
necessarily,
okay.
yeah. Pretty well distributed across the state.
Okay.
Checkerboard. Yep.
Yeah. I think.
But they have them all over. So
Yeah.
they're open to it and they have somebody specifically tasked to look at that, but they have to be sold at market rate, which makes it very hard to get the affordable component to it.
Okay.
So she's trying to figure that out. I actually had a meeting with her this week.
Oh. That isn't Crosby Carter by any chance, is it?
Yes,
Did it? Okay, so Crosby Carter used to work for TRPC. We briefly had her at the Regional Housing Council for a month and then she left to go work for TNR, but she mentioned that project to me before she left. So it's great. That means she's very familiar with this area and she's very innovative. And so I think she'll be a really good source of creative solution. So I don't know, mobile manufactured home parks, I think revisiting those, they have historically been an affordable option. And protecting the ones we have, as well as how do we establish new ones in
that's
appropriate
hard.
areas?
That's hard to do because mobile home parks are only good for low income once they're already established, but building them up. The people that have low income, they're not going and buying $130,000 mobile home to put on $1,000 a month lot. But they're already low income.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more footprint
It's still affordable these days.
Yeah, I think it's a footprint thing. It's like getting back to that, if they're able to support septic systems in mobile home parks, well, why can't we do it with cottage housing developments?
I'd love to see it, yeah.
I did think it was really interesting that 16,000, is that units? Were in that above 80%,
Above 120.
above 120. And I think this is the primary challenge I think we have with affordable housing. The fact that there are people in that income bracket with dollars to spend. So until you satisfy that demand, it's not gonna start trickling down.
Yeah.
And that's a tremendous.
We talked about that,
Amount of
that
housing.
essentially the folks looking for a home in that bracket don't find one, so then they
Settle.
bid up something in a lower bracket. But yeah, it was, and I'm not sure if other counties have stumbled on that as they were.
Pretty sure
Yeah.
it's gotta
Looking
be
at the numbers.
because of the
Yeah.
What
historic.
does that equate to today in a home price? Does that bracket start at like $550,000 or $600,000 in, at the 120%?
Well, the question, you could just look at how much that like 30% of your monthly. of your
Yes.
income
We don't
is.
take that into account for the home ownership, but
Yeah, it's 123,000 and greater is the 120% on up for here in Thurston.
For.
we do have a
household income.
calculation in our document on that, but I forget what it is, how you determine what
So,
that income.
limited
house-
space in Indian Summer.
Yeah,
But you could translate that into an estimated mortgage payment.
yeah, I bet you it is $600,000 homes and that thing, huh?
Mortgage rates
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
Maybe
That's
not.
not-
With interest rates now, it'd be probably closer to 5.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think when the planning folks from the different jurisdictions saw that is where we're just like, we just need more of everything everywhere. It's like the distribution, at least in Thurston County, is spread out across all of the income.
And the market's gonna wanna service those 16,000 first.
That was the point I was making earlier. It's like, yeah, I mean, you're not
Always.
gonna, you know, and you can't say that once that's built, that then it's gonna trickle down. No, then it's just gonna stop. It's not gonna, nothing's
Not
gonna.
necessarily.
trickle.
Economics says that like you wanna basically wring every dollar out before you stop wringing it.
Well, that's why I was saying minimum densities in those areas where you really want a higher density ensures that you at least get, a certain level of development and you're not getting, the $500,000 home in areas where you don't want the $500,000 home because you want the lower grade.
Yeah, and I think there's
Not
market.
perfect.
The
but-
$500,000 home is gonna be, all the homes are gonna be $500,000 until everybody who has $500,000 to spend has a home.
That's a good point.
And I think you can incentivize through density bonuses and lower development fees and impact fees and all that kind of stuff. I think that would be a really good idea. Well, does anybody else have anything on this topic for tonight? Thanks again. We do appreciate you coming.
I think
Real quick, going back to the thing you said about surplus land having to be sold at market rate. What, or market value?
DNR.
What's that?
For DNR,
For DNR, yeah.
because they can't realize less than its market value because it goes to schools. and
Yeah,
it's
they have to
But
make
what
money.
could a local jurisdiction do with zoning to impact
to Change
the
the
market
value
value?
of that property.
Like zone it so you can only build something that's actually impossible to build, and so now there's no value to the land anymore.
It's.
And then as soon as it's sold, zone it again for what you want.
I mean, I don't know why there couldn't be just partnership. So like we're buying land to satisfy
all
our
our money,
habitat
really.
conservation plan.
Right, so.
A lot of properties the county may look at to purchase might already have homes on it or have impacted areas that we don't need for our HCP, like mitigation, for mitigation credits. So like, why wouldn't the county partner with the Thurston County Land Trust or some other affordable housing provider? So it's, and then on that land trust model, like county owns the land, but they
That's a
can
great
use the
opportunity,
units.
yeah.
And so it seems like DNR, DFW, like the state owns a lot of land in our county. That sort of looking for those partnership models instead of just putting them out to market, like, no, we're gonna be part of the solution. I don't know.
Well, I forget the name of the individual, but she's your girl, at least at that agency, and then the other ones, she might know somebody,
Crosby.
yeah, Crosby. Because she's pulling out all the stops to find a solution.
Let's zone it so that it has no value.
But then you probably can't build housing on it.
Oh, no, then you rezone it. Let's go.
Well, if you value it at zero, you probably have to put it out for everybody to buy and you don't want everybody to buy it.
I'm
All right.
afraid the GMA doesn't work now. Joel, I'm sorry.
Well, let's, thank you again. Let's move on to our next agenda item.
Wants to stay. I think he's enjoying.
Well, I was gonna try to get back for put my son to bed, but he's already in bed, so.
Oh, sorry.
No,
you
it's
really
fine.
don't have to
I'm
stay.
here. No, I'm actually interested, depending on.
Jurisdiction eminent domain, they can sell it for less than market rate.
Okay.
Oh,
I'll keep cleaning out rent in Big Harbor before I can afford a home.
Well, do you have any staff updates for us?
Have interviews tomorrow for the new agriculture program manager position. We're really excited about that because our team would be whole. And there's a lot of work coming up, so we'd like that. There was no shift in the budget, no adding back of optional items that I know of. And our professional services budget has been cut as well, so we'll have to be creative about how we get some of the docket projects done without some professional services support. But more to come. And then I did provide in front of you, these are the boards that were agreed at the open house. Now is an appropriate time. I'd be happy to give you a quick update on how that turned out. So it was an open house planned within like 6 weeks of us assigning staff to the project. The intent was to make sure people are aware that this project is on the docket, it's part of our work plan. Also, make them aware of their opportunities to engage as it goes through the public review process. The landowner was there to hear from his adjacent property, or his adjacent neighbors, what all their concerns were. It was a good turnout. It was over 50 people, and a lot of those were folks that live directly next to the property and that have been there for 20+ years. And so we definitely learned some things. We had a debrief today on how we're gonna do these differently. Everyone wanted to crowd around the one board that showed the purple and the green, and that's where the landowner was standing. And so staff kept trying to like get around to like answer questions, but you know, it was a great opportunity for neighbors and other folks interested in the project to hear from the applicant themselves rather than staff, because it's not our project, why they're proposing this, what their intentions are. So next steps are them providing an updated SEPA checklist. What you see before you is different than what they initially put in for the project to be put on the docket. The green area is new. It was all purple. So now they are looking at conserving in perpetuity about 170 acres of open space, but they need to submit a checklist. They might even come back with more changes after hearing from neighbors. And we welcome that. That was kind of the intention, like hear concerns and see if there's additional information that you want to provide. Are there changes you want to make to the map in response to that or the plan in response to that? So the intention is that they give us all that info, that we will be before the planning commission probably in January, February with the first like official briefing. And that the research that staff is doing now includes the feedback that we receive from the community.
So are we gonna be able to see, I mean, is there a public record about what transpired at the?
Yep. So we are using our new survey tool, which I'm hoping you will appreciate. Thanks to Tasha, we are trying to collect more information about like who's providing these comments, what their concerns are. So we printed off essentially like versions of our comment form or survey and brought it to the meeting. We're inputting all those into the survey tool and we're gonna create a report. So a summary report for the public hearing, and the hope is to have that done before Thanksgiving, before we go off. And so happy to share that here. I mean, the whole purpose really of this is so that we can bring it before the planning commission. But because of the level of concern around this proposal, we also just want to be open and transparent with folks that want to be engaged. And so if people have signed up to receive project emails, they're also going to get updates on, hey, here's the summary report, here's what we heard. Is there anything you want to add? So yeah, you'll probably end up with a lot at your first briefing from the public.
Just out of curiosity for my little pea brain. What are these buildings? Do you know what that little industry is going on in the middle of it?
Mind if I look at the ones? The other, oh, so it is an old dairy. It's an old dairy. It's been in the family for multiple generations, I learned, the open house. It is not on prime farmland soils, though. It was kind of a surprise to the Ag Advisory Committee, because this has been on their radar, that it wasn't mapped in any of the options.
All right. Did you want to go through the?
Oh, so that was just that was an acknowledgement of all the work you've done. You can like take it around with you and be like, see what they did this year? This is why I wasn't around all summer.
We got a ton of stuff done in the first 9 months.
I should have put a gold star on it.
Yeah,
No, I mean, that is, I know it like fits on one page, but we went through that with our resident advisory group. Which is, you know, some of representatives of our environmental organizations, and they were, yeah, there's a lot of great work represented on that one sheet. So thank you.
All right, well, we're gonna move on to our calendar, and our December 6th work session will be Commerce Climate Presentation. Is there anybody that thinks that they will not be able to make it to our December 6th meeting? And we do tentatively have a meeting scheduled for December 20th as well, but we'll see how that goes.
The only thing we would potentially have on that night, if you wanted to gather that close to the holidays, is a follow-up on the housing allocation. Like basically the presentation that we'll be giving to the board, or you could watch the board.
When is that?
Let me confirm. I think it's December 7th is when they're coming, but.
That's right. You just say December 7th.
On December 6th, we will make the determination of whether we're gonna meet for December 20th if you don't have something pressing to fill on December 20th. And I can see.
Oh, no, it's been determined.
Yeah, I'm pretty good with those, yeah.
Ixnay on the,
You don't want to come hang out with me? I did it.
even on December 6th, I'm gonna be hungover from Krampusnacht.
All the more reason to come. There might be some, I mean, that will be the sunsetting of this particular planning commission as well, so there might be reason to get together for that. So, but we'll make that decision on December 6th, when we know what else could be on our calendar. With that, we're gonna move to the good of the order, and I know for sure in the good of the order, we have Commissioner Wheatley's email topics that she's gonna lead off with, but if anybody else has anything for that as well, we'll get to it after Commissioner Wheatley's topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's 8:30, so I apologize for, we're already half an hour over our supposed meeting ending time, and I'm gonna bring up another, whole can of worms here. And I'm very appreciative. I started thinking about this when I got into some conversation with one of the attendees of the Beaver Open House, and I thank you for turning around the questions so quickly to Tasha and Ashley. But basically I asked a series of questions about This has to do with citizen initiated amendments to the Growth Management Act. So basically things like this rezone request. And I just asked some basic questions, and Ashley, I mean, you know, you can tell me if I'm characterizing it right or not, but I was just asking how often do they carry over past that, you know, like you make an application for a certain 2-year cycle. And it seems like a lot of these applications don't make it through that 2-year cycle. I mean, and that was true. A lot don't. There are a lot that are sort of hanging over that then have to be put back. Or, you know, and that was my next question is, well, aren't they just supposed to, I mean, if you make an application and it's for this cycle and it isn't completed, isn't that the end of it? And wouldn't they have to, you know, reapply to go through the next cycle? And in Thurston County, that's not the case. They just kind of carry over. And I forget the other questions, but, you know, that concerns me. I feel like we need to really think about whether this process is working correctly. Certainly for the people making the applications, they would like, I'm sure, like a timely approach and not have it wait through in some cases, you know, 3 docket cycles or something like that. So that's a problem. And then it leads to, you know, the whole point of it is supposed to be sort of transparency. And it becomes a less transparent process. We have these open houses that, as far as I could tell, looking at the MRSC recommendations for how these kinds of amendments are approached, I don't see it in anybody else, you know, in the ones that they had. I didn't see open houses as part of the process. How is a decision made to make an open house or not? You know, it just seems to me that Thurston County is ripe for a revisit to how it handles citizen initiated amendment. And I think that the application form needs to be revised to be more consistent with the GMA and with what other jurisdictions do. There could be sort of subcategories. There hasn't been a lot of thought about that. And a lot of jurisdictions provide like a flow chart. So if you're a potential applicant, you can see how the process flows through. And it's very clear from everything that I read that the expectation is it's going to flow through in that cycle. It's not going to carry over to another cycle. So how can we address that? Some of the jurisdictions, and I think this is what Thurston County maybe ought to think about, they don't put it on the docket. They have a separate process for addressing citizen initiated amendments. So, you know, and the typical process is somebody makes their application, you know, there's often, but not always required to have a conference. Then they submit their application. Then that gets reviewed by staff. There is a report. There's a staff report that is then made part of the record on that. And then, you know, by whatever route, it goes to winds up at the Planning Commission. All of this happens before the Board of Commissioners looks at it. It's an automatic process. And it's one that has a required flow. And the dates and fees on some of the forms are set, and it's for, you know, this cycle, you know, 2024 or whatever it is. So the person going in doesn't have an expectation, you know, they can expect it to be done within the flow of that, you know, cycle that they're applying for. I couldn't find any of them that talk about what happens if it doesn't, but some of them say, you know, well, we'll look at it, you know, we will take maybe 500 of your bucks to look at it. Then if it's decided to carry it through, we'll charge you another 2,000. Quite honestly, I couldn't even find the fee. You know, it says it's published in the fee schedule. I couldn't find it. It's just
It's there.
well, I couldn't find it, so that was not transparent to me.
And
So-
there is a flow document for both.
Okay.
For both the docket process. I'm not saying that they can't
Well,
be
I'm
improved.
just saying
but-
that I think it's worth considering pulling it out of the docketing process and having it have its own process. And then if we're gonna have this thing where it carries over into the next preliminary docket, how sure are we that, do other jurisdictions do that? I couldn't really find that. And so that remains a question for me. It doesn't seem like the right way to do it. It doesn't seem like the transparent way to do it. And that's just my thoughts about that.
I think the reason for the docket process is for allocation of funding for the staff to do the work to bring it forward to the planning commission and the BOCC. Yes or no?
It's a work plan, so a lot of times the reasons that things carry over is because board priorities shift, staff resources aren't available. So like the Beaver Creek rezone, it wasn't a high priority. I think it was the lowest priority, but as you can see from the sheet, we got through enough that we were able to allocate staff resources.
Well,
We'll have staff resources for the most important elements of our comprehensive plan, and yet we've got resources for this. There's something I share these concerns. I second these concerns. I feel like there's something goofy about this, and it feels like a way, and this is not new. It has for years that I've been on the planning commission felt like a bizarre process that some of these things pop onto our agenda, and it's like literally buying your way into a process. Why other people are waiting for a number of processes and when we get to things and when the board prioritizes them. I don't understand this buying your way into prioritization on a docket. So I share concerns that this process should be reconsidered and evaluated.
So it's outside our purview as staff.
no, I know, I'm raising it to the
just-
planning commission, not to staff.
Okay,
I'm talking to the planning commission that I think this is important. We could consider saying so, sending a.
I think we have some other restrictions too, that pretty much, anything that changes the comp plan has to go through the planning commission. There's just no way around that. Any changes to the planning commission has to go through, or to the comp plan has to go through the planning commission. So the docketing process is the way that we do it. I don't know if there's a better way to do it.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. There is a way to separate. You can separate the citizen initiated amendments from the docketing process. Some jurisdictions don't put it on the docket. They have their own
Well,
flow.
the docket is a required portion of GMA.
Right. Yeah, I'm not saying don't have a docket.
You're just gonna have a separate docket.
There's a
Right now we have a
separate
development.
process. There's a separate process for citizen initiated amendments to other kinds of changes to the,
Board initiated amendments.
yeah.
Those are really the two kind of amendments to the comp
Well,
plan, or
city,
board
other
initiated or.
jurisdictions can request there's all kinds of permutations. My particular concern is just basically these things where people want to rezone or they want to do something, and they go to the county to ask for it because the GMA isn't allowing it, or the zoning, what we wound up with or whatever.
I have a question. So I think it sounds like a really kind of much tidier process. You take some of the need for it to go through the board docketing process. I think it's tidy, it's more transparent. I wonder if we have the resources as a county to basically give things that straight track onto our docket, which is essentially what it would do.
Well,
And so
Okay.
I think that would be, I'd be curious to hear kind of what that would do to the staffing from the county. And then also, you know, I think we've been in a good situation. We've had a fantastic chair who's helped push us through our docket items. Like what happens when it starts to become, we don't have the ability to use the docketing process to prioritize the work if there's a straight track.
Well, the difference is that those jurisdictions that do that, like I said, they require a staff report. If this I'll be frank, if this Beaver Creek thing had gone through that process, it would be a non-starter because in the first place, they don't even answer the questions right. Okay, it would have been a non-starter until they went back and they took the process seriously. And I think if you looked at the jurisdictions that do this, they make it really, really clear what's okay and what's not. And that you have to show that, and part of the confusion in this application is, I don't think they understood that the question about what's changed isn't like what's changed in the county and, oh gosh, we need more, warehousing. The question is what's changed on your property that's made
The rezone necessary.
rezone necessary. There are just things like that, if the process is well thought out and the staff report is required and the questions are good, it would be interesting as part of that to find out if any jurisdiction has felt overwhelmed. I doubt that they are. I think it has a natural, if you do it right, it limits itself.
Staff report might have been easier than an open house.
Well, so I do want to make sure that I know that the Beaver Creek open house materials are in front of you, but there has not been a staff report written yet. And to sort of hold on discussion on the merits of an application that hasn't been presented to you with all of the information.
Now, the staff report in these things, it's like the application is made and then the staff does a report. And if they don't have the information they need, they go back to the applicant and they make them get that information.
So we are,
And one of the things that that I've seen in at least a couple of the applications is what does this do to the neighbors? And so you don't have to have the county sponsor a question like that. You could require the landowner to go figure that out somehow and make that part of their, so that's what I'm saying. We could rethink this. It could actually become more efficient rather than less. It could cost the county less rather than more to change the process, I believe.
so we are only allowed as a county to update our comp plan once a year. So regardless of when they submit, it will always have to be rolled up into a package of whatever other comprehensive plan map amendments that are being considered, which I think is probably one of the reasons that they put it on the docket with the other comprehensive plan amendments. And we do have two dockets. We've got the comprehensive plan amendment docket as well as the development code docket. The development code docket isn't restricted to that once a year requirement.
And that's because of county policy, not because of any state RCW.
No, it's
State.
state.
State says once a year.
Yeah, once a year outside of periodic review. Some jurisdictions, they only consider certain changes as part of periodic review or joint plan updates, but those are decisions made by our board, not by staff.
Right.
And there are other jurisdictions that when you're going through a periodic review update, they basically say, no new things will be placed on the docket. We're gonna focus on this, but that is the decision of the board or the elected officials, not staff.
Right, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about things staff should do.
No,
yeah.
but for those of you that might not know, as you said, the docketing process is hard to understand and can be confusing. The staffing resource concerns with the comp plan are actually professional services dollars. We need to be able to pay public health and economic development corporation to help us update those chapters. So even if we had more staff, we still would not be able to do that work without some professional services.
I think another concern that some people might have, and I'm not sure if it's a legitimate concern or not, is if if we moved away from the model that we have now and put more of the work, the initial work on the applicant instead of on staff, we trust that the applicant's going to be giving us fair, full, and honest answers.
Well, that's what the staff review helps to assure. Because it's not gonna be accepted until they do.
So I guess I am wondering what, if you've seen a staff report, maybe getting an example, because staff does review, like with the POG site specific, rezone proposal, like that is what is brought before the planning commission. So is this a different kind that you have
I don't know, I'm just going off of what I've read on MSRC and then following up on, or MRSC, sorry, and then following up on actually reading some of them.
I have read many applications and most of them are woefully
They're terrible.
inaccurate, not filled out, bunch of bullshit, not applicable, and even just nonsensical answers. And so if there's a staff report process happening where they're evaluating that and sending it back to the applicant, I have not observed that, the effect of that, because the majority of applicants are poor applications.
And this one would have been sent back, I can guarantee it. The answers were not acceptable.
So it was sent back, and that's
But it's
why
still-
we're waiting. Well, we don't.
Then
so
why
I
have an
just-
open house on it at this point?
Because it's part of the staff review, and even as they're considering what additional information they're gonna provide, thought it was important that they hear from the community.
So the county sponsored something that in other jurisdictions, the applicant is expected to do.
I don't know of a jurisdiction that would have when you say
I'll say,
sponsor,
like, if there's a question, what impact would this have on your neighbors?
that question, the burden of answering that question falls on the applicant
Right.
to provide that information.
Everything that staff does on, say, this Beaver Creek application does get charged back to the application though, financially, doesn't it?
There's the application fee and then, the collection fees, but it's,
Closer to 500, 2,000.
I'd have to look up what the amount is. It's not a lot for a comprehensive.
Who's gonna
plan.
end up paying for like the open house that was done? The applicant end up absorbing that cost, or will the county end up absorbing that cost?
I will have to check to see if it's recoverable or non-recoverable, and that's also a decision made by the board.
See, this is the lack of transparency in the process. Anyway.
I've worked in a lot of other jurisdictions, and I am responsible for requesting that an open house be held, because I think it is in service to the community to know about a project as early as possible and be able to share their concerns, so that even as we are doing that staff report and that review, that we know that lighting is a real concern. Like lighting pollution to those surrounding property owners is a real concern. And I learned that there. It was like, oh, okay. Wells, we had a number of people talk about their own personal wells and, issues they're having with their wells and wanting to understand if any new development there would impact their wells. Like, those are good things to know, so that, because it might not pop up on a map, but then I can go to Kevin Hansen, our hydrogeologist, and be like, okay, so we have concerns from neighbors about wells. What would that look like? If it was developed residential, that might actually impact it. It might have pretty big impacts too. So anyway, I found it valuable to hear from folks. And I hope the planning commission will as well, because otherwise you wait till the public hearing. And then at that point, the staff report's written, there isn't a lot of room for.
I tend to agree with you that early and often public engagement is a good thing. I would like to see applicants paying for that, though. But that's not our decision. Did you have more, Commissioner Wheatley?
No, I just thought I'd open that can of worms.
Did anybody?
Docketing really quick, applications closed today. And so there's a lot of carryovers that weren't put on the official docket that the board will revisit.
Beaver Creek was the lowest priority and we got to it.
Oh, there's the official docket.
Preliminary.
There's
docket.
the preliminary docket. There's a lot on the preliminary docket that didn't make it on the official docket. And every cycle, things can get added from the preliminary docket onto the official docket.
So I can't see why not wait until next year to do the open house then, because you don't know if this is gonna move forward. Or-
Well, I mean, between now and next year, I mean, for me, I'm managing resources and looking at the work plan that the board has given me. I mean, at
But
what
it's a new
point,
docket though.
but at what point do we not assign staff? Do we make that, I mean, I can't make that call in August or September, like we had staff assigned at the end of September or mid-September. It seems a little, I mean, disingenuous to not assign staff to do work that's on the work plan. Because next March,
Otherwise, we wouldn't have anything to discuss
no,
At this meeting?
at this meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that information is just good to have. The board is gonna need that when they're trying to prioritize their docket. That will inform them to
Well,
a certain
that's
degree.
true. That could help.
I mean, we're working on everything on the docket. So there's Bar Holdings, there's Beaver Creek, there's the Natural Landmark Program, Nisqually Sub-Area Plan, the Joint Code updates. All of those have staff assigned and we're working on all of them.
Did you have anything, Commissioner Day?
I just think that there might be like a different discussions here about, and again, I don't know what really falls under our purview. I mean, I love process improvement. It's like one of my favorite things. But how much of that is our purview? I mean, we can write all the letters we want, but and I think the core of where I think Helen is more about transparency, like clear process. And then I think we have concerns about who bears the burden of the process. Because, we could hold 30 open houses for these for all I care. And as long as it's not the taxpayers in the county who are picking up the tab for these private requests for private development. I think those two issues about transparency and who pays for it, I think those are legitimate concerns. I don't know if they're our purview. Doesn't mean I wouldn't be interested in thinking about it. So that's just kind of where I land on this. Really interesting questions. Probably prudent.
Sure. All right, I'm wrapping up this conversation. Does anybody have anything else for the good of the order? All right, having no further business, this meeting is adjourned.
See you on the 6th. Thank you.